Hi there, and a huge welcome to the session on the future of inclusion for Flexpo Business. I'm Ursula Tavender, and I am the content director here at Flexpo Business and for Flexpo. And I am absolutely thrilled to be joined today by Karen Brookes, who is the Director of People and Infrastructure at Sir Robert McAlpine, who has extraordinary passion for inclusion and flexible working, and believes they're inextricably linked, don't you, Karen? So welcome, Karen. It's great to be here today. We're also joined by Natasha Oppenheim, who's the CEO of No Desire to Retire, who provide advice, advocacy and recruitment for people over 50 who want to remain in work. And they also work with employers to create an age-positive environment. So thanks for being here with us today, Natasha. Finally, we're joined by Toby Mildon, who is a diversity and inclusion architect and works with organisations to drive sustainable, inclusive growth. He's also the author of the recently published brilliant book, Inclusive Growth, which I would recommend if you haven't already read it. So thank you all for being here with us today. We're talking about the future of inclusion and making the impossible happen, seemingly impossible happen through flexible working. And I think that over the course of the pandemic in the last several months, constraints that were previously there of working Monday to Friday in a fixed location have been blown out of the water, haven't they? And I think that previously in a pre-COVID world, there were many demographics of people who were effectively shut out of the working world because they weren't able to commit to that Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 in a fixed location. And so we're really interested today in having a discussion about what that means for the future of inclusion and how we can leverage all of the lessons that COVID-19 has gifted us with so far, to create and build a working world that is more inclusive for everybody and where everyone can truly thrive. So as I say, I'm thrilled to be joined by our panelists today. We're going to kick off with a question about the world that we knew pre-COVID and how it contrasts to now. So as we've said, many demographics were effectively shut out of the workforce because they couldn't commit to that Monday to Friday 9 to 5. But now that's been blown out of the water, and COVID's proved, the pandemic's proved that we can be really creative about ways of working, and it is possible so many people in such numbers to work flexibly. What does this mean for the future of inclusion and for the world of work as a whole? Karen, if I come to you first on this one, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, Ursula, delighted to participate. I think certainly from our perspective in construction, it's as probably people would imagine, a very traditional environment. So Robert McAlpine's 151 years old, and I think people would have said, you know, agile and flexible working isn't really possible beyond, you know, working part-time or perhaps a job share opportunity, and actually doing so predominantly was, you know, what would be head office group services type roles as opposed to being on a project site. I think what COVID has taught us is actually overnight, you know, when we shut projects down and we all started to work from home, it proved that actually a lot more flexible and agile working is absolutely possible. And roles that we perhaps hadn't imagined were possible from home in terms of, you know, being able to, you know, do MEP, being able to do design. You don't have to be on site in order to be able to do that. And a lot of the information that you need is systems related, and it's somewhere on the internet, you know, and on your laptop in terms of being able to do so. So I think what I want to do for Sir Robert McAlpine is capitalise on actually what COVID has taught us from an agile and flexible working perspective, because it's meant that, you know, we've coped with, you know, schools closing and, you know, and childcare being very difficult for some of our employees, both male and female, you know, in terms of, and it's made us think about actually what's the art of the possible in terms of agile and flexible working, and I want to make sure we don't lose any of that, because it's very easy to, you go back into work on a project and it becomes, you know, very quickly what it used to be as opposed to what it needs to be in terms of moving forward. Having been back on site recently, up in the Manchester area, you know, it's very prevalent that the sites are very different now to how they were before, both from the type of PPE that they have to wear, you know, the social distancing that they're keeping from one another. So we've had to rethink and re-engineer the way we work, as well as, you know, how we work. So I think a combination of all of those things creates a fantastic platform for us and for all of the other organisations out there to really start to think about what might this mean in terms of not just flexing start and finish times, but actually thinking about actually where do you work, how do you work, you know, does it have to be in an office, does it have to be on a project site, actually could it be from home, you know, could it, our offices themselves, I imagine that office footprint will be very, very different in terms of perhaps smaller and perhaps much more about facilitated to collaborative working as opposed to individual workstations. You know, so that actually individuals are working together as opposed to working individually, you know, where you're in your little pod all on your own. I think all of that is up for grabs and definitely something that we're working through changing.
I think you're so right, Karen. It's really interesting, I think, how people's mindsets have changed around what's possible in these last few months, isn't it? And actually it's, you know, I mean, I'm absolutely heartbroken it's taken this kind of human tragedy to stimulate this kind of discussion and this creativity, but actually for me that's providing a real sense of purpose and comfort in a really, really challenging time for everybody, isn't it? And for me that provides a lot of hope. And you know, the purpose of the discussion today around inclusion, it gives me hope that lots more people will be able to participate in the workforce in a more meaningful and inclusive way. And for me, that is probably one of the biggest benefits that's starting to emerge from this time. Natasha, I'm really interested to get your thoughts on this.
I mean, I think dealing with older people who have, you know, at the beginning were very strongly labelled as vulnerable was actually very, very difficult for a lot of people, because although they might have been vulnerable to catching COVID, they weren't any less capable of working. And it was very important to recognise that these older people could contribute just as well before to the workforce. But anyway, the label of vulnerability, you know, isn't the headline agenda now. But I think that as a result of COVID, you know, and this mass adoption of remote working and successful adoption of remote working, even in industries, as Karen was saying, that previously people presumed just it wasn't possible. I think actually for the older demographic, that is going to be a very large win, and for employers too, because employers are going to be able to access talent regardless of geography that might have put off some applicants. So as an employer, you'd be able to get really the best talent regardless of geography. But for older workers, I think it's really interesting, because previously they might have been excluded a lot more for traveling to work. Maybe they'd done 30 years of commuting and they didn't want to do that anymore. And this mass adoption of remote working means that suddenly they are able to apply for those jobs and get those jobs and perform those jobs brilliantly, you know, from their own home. And so I think that's, you know, that's one of the key changes of being able to be more inclusive and get towards a multi-generational workforce. And actually on the older demographic, you know, there's a lot of evidence to show that they have the highest ability to telework. They're more likely to have and to get jobs that can be done from home. But I think the most interesting piece of research that I found, which was from Global Workplace Analytics, was they've been most successful remote working than all other age groups. And that is very, very counter stereotypical. And I think getting that word out will really help the inclusion of older people in the workforce, you know, as this COVID pandemic continues, and hopefully afterwards too.
So interesting to see those shifts, isn't it? And how that can present opportunities for all these different people. It's really, really wonderful. Toby, can you give any examples of opportunities that have been opened up to people from kind of typically hard to reach demographics as a result of inclusive change programs that you've been part of?
Yes, I think with the increase of people working more flexibly, working from home because of the coronavirus, I mean, it is opening up opportunities for people that would traditionally find it difficult to get to the office. So a few examples are it's opened up opportunities for disabled people who might have struggled with actually physically getting to the office because of lack of accessibility on public transport, but also other disabilities like neurodiversity or people who are on the autism spectrum who might struggle to work in an open plan office environment, but can very happily work remotely in an office at home, or work independently at home. And actually, some of these roles, they don't need to be physically done in an office. So take, for instance, a software engineer. Somebody who's a software engineer can do that job from home. When they need to work with their team, they can do it online using platforms like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. And for some people, say, when I worked in the past with, before I got into diversity and inclusion, I was a project manager in software development, and I had members of my team who were autistic, and they really struggled with those kind of face-to-face working environments. But the ability to kind of work online, communicate with the team through like instant messenger, actually made them, they could get on really well with the job and be really productive in their job. I mean, that's just one example. I've just focused on disability, but actually it's opening up opportunities across the board. Where people need flexibility, it's helping working parents who've got childcare responsibilities as well. And it's opening up opportunities for lots of people.
I think that's the key, isn't it? Opportunity. It keeps coming up already.
Yeah.
Karen, I'd really be interested to talk to you about the way that Sir Robert McAlpine has embraced flexible working, particularly on the front line, because I think that there can be this misperception within organisations, certainly within the organisations that I work with, that equity means offering the same to everybody, and something that can hold leaders back from really embracing multiple, a menu of flexible working options. Is that we can't offer the same thing to everybody. So, for example, in a frontline role, you may not be able to offer remote working or the same sort of options for flexibility as you would to an office position. But how do you address that challenge, and how have you done that in Sir Robert McAlpine, and how does that affect your overall inclusivity as a business?
I think at Sir Robert McAlpine, we've worked really hard. One, I think in terms of getting the base policy right, and that's a skill, I think, in itself, in terms of not making that too rigid and providing enough flexibility that a line manager can adapt and flex the opportunity based on the individual. Clearly, when you're on a project, there are issues in terms of ensuring that you're obviously there, present in terms of when you need to be. There are roles clearly where that's not necessary. So you could be, if you're in a planning role, unless you need to be on site in terms of showing the engineers in terms of exactly how to interpret those plans, then there wouldn't be a need for you to be on site. But there are other roles clearly in terms of, if you're more of an operative, you're a bricklayer, you're a carpenter, you're a painter and decorator, and we're at the finishing end of a project, then obviously you need to be there. But I think it's about providing guidance to the line managers and ensuring that they can flex that based on the individual. So whether that's about flexing people's start and finishing times, and considering having rotas so that actually the work gets done for the client, but actually we're rotating individuals around so that you give people that flexibility. The dad who wants to ensure that he can take the children to school or pick the children up from school, etc. You can't automatically always assume that it's mum that does that. But also in terms of when you work, how you work, in terms of can you work from home. I think our line managers on sites now will be much more mindful of what the art of the possible is, because I will admit I've had some interesting conversations with project managers on sites, you know, in the last 3 years I've been here, in terms of, well, what do you mean by flexible working, Karen? That's not possible on site. You know, for a project manager. I said, oh, that's really interesting. You know, so how about if we agree at the beginning of a project, I know there's a cost implication actually, that we have 2 project managers and that they job share and they work 3 days a week each and they have a handover in the middle of the week. And actually, why can't that work? Oh, I've never thought about that. You know, so actually, you know, it's a simple thing, but actually it is possible if you just, you know, perhaps open your horizons up a little and start to think about what's possible. HR business partners are very attuned to supporting line managers and providing that guidance. And clearly, when it's not going well, you know, we do have a grievance process. We hope not to get to that stage, in terms of if individuals aren't being given the flexibility that's needed for them to be able to, you know, work more flexibly and in an agile way. They're very rare, I have to say. But, you know, they are necessary in terms of, you know, in some cases, making sure individuals get what they need.
Thanks, Karen. So, Toby, I'm going to come to you next, and I'm really interested in your perspectives here. So, when we've undergone a lot of change, haven't we, in the last few months? I think the working world has really been turned on its head, and I'm really interested to find out from you what your perspective is on how a business can make sure that any change programme is truly inclusive and that it takes into consideration the needs of all the different demographics within its workforce.
Yes, I think the first point I want to make is that when it comes to diversity, inclusion and flexible working, first of all, you need change management program in place. It sounds really obvious, but my experience so far in diversity and inclusion is that there isn't proper, robust change management put in place when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So if you're implementing a new HR system, you often have a change management process in place. You know who your stakeholders are. You know what success looks like. You've looked at your risks and issues. You've got your roadmap. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, sometimes it's a bit like the wild west. So it's a bit like, you know, it's a bit sporadic. You go after lots of initiatives. It's, you know, you go after the thing that seems to be flavor of the month. And what that means for organizations is that it's difficult to deliver on diversity and inclusion and get change happening. And it's difficult to measure the impact that the work that you're trying to do is having on the organization. And quite often, you know, one of the frustrations that my clients always come back to me with is that they're frustrated because they have that lack of impact, or they can't measure what the return on investment is when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So the first point is you need to have like a proper, robust, you know, change management kind of framework in place for diversity and inclusion, like you would with other important programs in the organization. The second point is that in order to do this inclusively, you need to include, again, this sounds really obvious, you need to include a diverse range of employees. So very often, diversity and inclusion is kind of led from the center. It's led from HR, but actually diversity and inclusion touches all corners of the business. So you need to have diversity involved in terms of business functions. So not just HR, but you need to get IT involved. You need to get your procurement team involved. You need to get the people that run your offices or your workplace involved. You need to get your marketing and sales people involved. You need to get your product people involved and your service people. So basically the whole organization. And you need to make sure that the people that also get involved in the change program or the change work that you're doing also reflect the diversity of the community that you're there to serve. So, I mean, organizations often say to me, you know, what is diversity? And I say, first of all, we need to be shifting the conversation towards inclusion. But in essence, diversity, one way that we can look at diversity is how reflective is your organization of the community in which you're based in. So if you're a business based in Manchester, you know, your talent pool and the diversity around you is very different to if you're an organisation based in Exeter. So, how reflective is the organisation of the community you're based in, the talent pool on your doorstep, and the customers that you serve? That's the first point around diversity. But when you do implement change, it's really important to be inclusive, to make sure you've got that diversity represented, because we know that with diversity you get better problem solving, greater innovation, and these are the things that you need to leverage in change management. You need, when you're thinking about implementing change in a business, you need to be coming up with smarter decisions. You need to have innovation and creativity, and you get that from having a diverse bunch of people working on the initiative.
Absolutely, I think that's vital for any change management program to be successful, isn't it? But I think one thing that can really thwart organisations' progress and success with change programs and much more is unconscious bias, isn't it? So I'd like to talk about that next. And in your view, Natasha, I'll come to you first on this, but I'd really love to get a mix of perspectives on this. Unconscious bias training work, and what in your view are the routes to success for truly overcoming unconscious bias?
Okay, well, I think the first step is awareness, and that's a lot of the problem with unconscious bias, as people are just not aware of their bias. There's this great psychometric profile test that I think I've mentioned to you before, but it's called Project Implicit, and it's run by Harvard University. It's a global project. It's been running for many, many years across the world. And it's an ongoing study that you can take to test your unconscious bias against a range of issues, whether it's sexism, ageism, or prejudices against a whole range of things. And basically what they find is that in general, 12% of people hold very, very strong biases. But the one outlier is ageism, where it's actually 25% of people who are very strongly ageist. And so I think the first step is acknowledging that this bias exists, you may have it, the magnitude of it, and then being able to say, okay, what should we do about it? And that's where we try and say, okay, well, we ask organizations to ask themselves, and I'm just speaking about this from an age point of view, but of course the bias can exist in any of the areas in which we've been talking about today. But we ask and say, are you an age positive environment? And what we mean by that is your organization truly multi-generational? And a lot of the issue is that often you're speaking to people who are 40 or 50 years different in age group. You might be speaking to someone who's age 20 and someone who's age 70. And the real difference is that the 70-year-old has been 20, but the 20-year-old hasn't been 70. And they don't have an awareness of what it might be like, what it could be. And so we try and say to people, would you hire your future self? And so first of all, awareness. Secondly, asking the organization and the individuals in the organization to reflect upon themselves. And then what we find is that, beyond awareness, training can have mixed results. And as Toby said, it has to be, properly embedded and part of not just a program isolated in itself, but drawing in everybody from all over the organizations. So what we actually advocate doing is hiring older workers, and as part of a multi-generational workplace. And so you can see the stereotypes debunked by action. By seeing an older worker in your workplace, you see that the bias and the stereotype is just that. It's a stereotype, but not the person standing in front of you or on the Zoom with you. The person that's contributing to your team, being your colleague, able to do the job as well as you, and probably do some bits better, and to need to improve on some bits as well. So just like you. And sometimes actually seeing, having this diverse workforce, countering unconscious bias by having a variety of people in the workplace can actually, the conscious effect can then affect the unconscious.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? Toby, have you got some thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I'm glad Natasha brought up the Harvard studies that they've been doing, the implicit association test, because it is a great body of work. What's really interesting is that I did the implicit association test myself, and the result was that I was mildly biased against disabled people, which is really interesting because I was born with a rare neuromuscular disability. I'm a full-time wheelchair user. My brother's got the same condition as me. I went to school with disabled kids. I've worked with disabled people. Yet I've got this, this mild bias against disabled people. And so I dug a little bit deeper to find out what was going on. And the result that I got was that, the reason why I've got this bias is because of, the biases formed through social conditioning. So we know that bias is created through partly the way that our brains are wired, but also through social conditioning. So, growing up, not having older disabled role models in my life, the way that disabled people are portrayed on TV and film, and things like that all contributed. What's interesting is that when I had that awareness, I think we start to enter into a little bit of dangerous territory, because what might happen is then I have kind of psychological responses to that. So when I'm in a situation at work where I'm hiring somebody, and then I'm deciding whether to, I'm down to 2 candidates. I've got a disabled candidate and a non-disabled candidate. Am I going to be more lenient on that disabled candidate now that I have the awareness that I've got this bias? So when clients ring me up and they say, can you do unconscious bias training? I say, yes, on the condition that I take people on a journey, that I go beyond awareness. So we go from awareness to interest to desire to action, because I want organizations to focus on bias within processes and systems. Yes, we can raise awareness that we have biases and as individuals, but I want to understand how bias impacts decision making. And I want to make sure that the processes and systems and the policies that you have place in your business stand up independently so that they reduce bias. So if we took something like your recruitment process and then broke it down into all its little steps, what is the bias happening at each step, and what is the bias happening in between the steps? So do you have an applicant tracking system or a careers website, for example, that's not accessible to people using screen readers, which means that somebody who's blind can't apply for the job at your company, and it's not obvious how somebody can apply to work for you if they can't access your careers website? Like, you don't have a phone number that people can ring up, or they can fill out a Word document instead of doing an online form or something like that. So it's about understanding where along a process or system there's opportunity for bias to exist. And it's about addressing it at that kind of systems level, because then when you get the process and the system right, it goes on autopilot, and you can then lessen the effects of bias.
Thanks, Toby. Amazing insights there. Would you like to build on this, Karen? I know you've done a huge amount of work on this, particularly in respect of recruitment at Robert McAlpine. I know you wanted to add your thoughts on this.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with Toby. I think making sure that you're looking at every aspect of your website, your ATS, the whole recruitment process end to end, because it's so easy. And we thought when we started the journey, yeah, everything's great, and then you look at it and you think, actually, no, for exactly the same reasons, we haven't gone through it. And for example, in terms of from an LGBT plus perspective, we hadn't looked at actually how it was worded. And actually, does that automatically put people off in terms of, because actually we're using certain phrases and certain terminology. So there's a lot to it, and you've got to constantly keep on top of it to make sure that you're eradicating those biases that most of us, if we're honest, most of the time don't see. They're not visible to us, and you have to work hard at making sure that you know, you're constantly doing that. And the training, the education of your line managers, we're potentially looking at blind CVs in terms of as our next step, to truly ensure that, you know, you're totally taking that applicant entirely and utterly based on the technical experience, capability and skills that are visible, as opposed to anything else. You know, and that's just part of the journey. We're not perfect yet, far from it, but you know, I think you constantly need to be reviewing all of the time.
I don't think any organisation is, and so many are held back from publicly talking about what they're doing because they don't think it's finished yet. But is it ever finished? This is ongoing work, isn't it? You know, and there's always room for us to do better. There's always learning to be learned, isn't there? There's always new things to embrace. And I think that particularly in respect of inclusivity from an agile working and flexible working point of view, the recruitment side of things is so vital and such a vital piece of the puzzle, isn't it? And so finally, before we sort of wrap up the session, does anyone have any thoughts they'd like to share around what employers can do to make work more accessible at the point of hire, in respect of flexible working, and what best practice looks like from that point of view?
So one of the pieces of advice that I give to my clients is to, first of all, go out and ask people what challenges they're having with trying to get into your business. So you can identify people who have put in job applications, for example, and invite them to one-to-one interviews or focus groups, because you need to start with understanding what the challenges are, because then you can start to put the right solutions. And I work with lots of organizations who, frankly, they start creating solutions without understanding what the problems are. And so it's a waste of time and money, but to put it blunt. So, you know, you need to understand what are the difficulties people are having, and then start to think creatively about what solutions that you can put in place. And I'm a big fan of kind of co-creation. So I work with those individuals and say, okay, if we were to do X or Y, which one do you think would have the biggest impact on you? And that co-creation approach is something you can do throughout the whole employee life cycle. You know, you mentioned people trying to get in at that recruitment level, but you can do it for people who want to go for a promotion in the business, for people who are going through a transformation at work. So it might be that they've become a parent for the first time. It might be that they've acquired a disability whilst at work. So start, it sounds a bit negative, start in the problem space to really understand what's going on for people, and then start to co-create solutions.
I think we do need to get a bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable, don't we, and sitting within that problem to have gain a more deep understanding of the problem. It's not an easy thing to do, particularly if that's something that doesn't come easily to any of us, does it? But for some people it can be very, very challenging. But Fran, I know you wanted to add your thoughts to this.
Yeah, sure. I think for us, I would totally agree with Toby in terms of listening to what's coming up from grassroots. So our 7 affinity networks are really helpful in this area in terms of shining a light on things that we perhaps haven't thought about, whether it be around ability, whether it be around age. Interestingly, we also have, which is perhaps a more unusual affinity network, a socio-economic group, looking internally and externally at, disadvantages in terms that perhaps coming from a disadvantaged background, in terms of ex-care leaver or an ex-offender, etc. And it's, by listening to what they've got to say, by listening to what their needs are, again, you can modify the recruitment processes internally or externally, and ensure that you're not biased, and actually that you're able to provide opportunities to those individuals to progress, either to join the organisation or to progress through the organisation. And we're very much a believer that it should be a meritocracy, and success should be based purely on your ability and your skills and capabilities.
Natasha, what would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I think, just building on what actually both Karen and Toby have been saying, I think a lot of the first step is the wording of what, the advert is for the job, because that is going to, as Karen mentioned on the before, that's going to affect whether someone even tries to apply, and then the next step is whether they have difficulty applying. But without realizing it, so much of the wording can be really off-putting to a lot of people. And so whether that is getting multiple people to check the advert that you might be putting out there, because that's the very first interaction that someone will have with knowing that there's an opening at your business. And so I think that really is an area to focus on.
Fantastic insights there. Thank you all so much. To wrap up then, if you could all share one piece of advice to organisations who are hoping to, or maybe watching this, aiming to help their organisations to become more inclusive, what would that one thing be? Toby, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so we're doing this webinar at the time of COVID-19. The economy is struggling at the same time, and I really do think that businesses are going to bounce back, but this is a perfect opportunity for them to introduce diversity and inclusion as an enabler of that regrowth. And I think they need to start thinking about it right now. The curve of the economy is going to start going back up. And those organizations that prioritize diversity and inclusion now for the regrowth of their business, I think, they will, my belief is that they're going to bounce back harder and faster than other organizations that deprioritize diversity and inclusion or don't think that it's strategically important to the growth of an organization.
Yeah, that's such an important point, isn't it? Natasha, what do you think? What would your one piece of advice be?
Well, I think that it's remembering how much change you can adapt in such a quick time. Everybody went from however they'd been doing their jobs, maybe for decades, to working from home in jobs that, as Karen mentioned, wasn't seen as possible. And that does open it up to a lot of people. So remembering, as hopefully, if the world starts to go back to a bit of what it looked like before with working patterns and employment rising, that so much more is possible in terms of flexibility, in terms of different people accessing work in different ways. And just to remember that shift, that creativity, it can work, and it can work quickly.
I think that's such a theme of this morning's discussion, isn't it? Possibility and opportunity. A great note to end on. Karen, what is your one piece of advice?
I think whilst technology is really, really important in terms of enabling, the recruitment process, I think we should always hang on to how important relationships are. And there's no substitute for that dialogue with individuals, and internally or externally, getting to know the person coming in or through the process, or understanding the individual that's already in the organisation. And relationships are what make organisations, and I think we forget that human element at our peril. So I would urge individuals to make sure that building the relationship is right at the heart of a recruitment process and what they do.
I couldn't agree with you more. I just think that this is fundamentally, it's about people, isn't it? And to your point, Natasha, about that you made at the start of when we started talking about unconscious bias, around just bringing people in and getting to know them as being a really, really key enabler in helping to build that inclusive culture. I think that's such a strong message from today's discussion, and I can't thank you all enough for your time. So thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for being here for our session on the future of inclusion.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.